Okay. I just hit it, so you should be able to get in. All right, thanks.
Perfect.
Take it away, John.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Like to welcome you to our presentation today. And our topic is on challenges and opportunities in law enforcement. So it's a pretty general topic, and we like at the end of the presentation to have some good feedback on that. Once again, law enforcement agencies in the United States are under scrutiny as public reacts to the shooting death of Dante Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a 13-year-old Adam Toledo in Chicago, Illinois, and Army Lieutenant Carson Nazaro being pepper sprayed in Windsor, Virginia. In all three cases, person who pulled the trigger was police officers. All of those took place while former Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin is on trial in Minnesota for the murder of George Floyd. And so it's just a lot of things going on. And these are some of the things that we would like to talk about. We're looking at community engagement, how we can build trust in law enforcement. Our panelist today is myself, John Tucker, and I'm a faculty member in the Criminal Justice Program, and our program director, Dwayne Lee. And also I have a special guest. I'm gonna introduce him, but I'm gonna let him introduce himself too. Is Adam Whitsett, General Counsel with SLED. And at this point, Adam, I want to turn it over to you, and I'd like for you to give a little bit of personal background about yourself, how you got involved in law enforcement, a little bit about your family, and so on. Because a lot of time we dehumanize law enforcement, and really that is not a fact. Law enforcement practitioners and personnel come from the community. We are part of the community. So at this time, Adam, can you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. As John said, I'm Adam Whitsett. I'm the current general counsel at SLED. I am a lawyer, not a law enforcement officer, and sort of part of my job responsibilities here are to help sort of craft policies, help sort of build that bridge between law enforcement and really sort of be that sounding board to make sure that all that we're doing and all that we're looking to do, one, passes constitutional muster, that it complies with all of the laws, and then we write policies trying to really better and advance, every aspect of law enforcement and every aspect of what we do. Went to the Citadel for undergraduate. Most of my mom's family is all from Charleston. My grandfather went to the Citadel, so I went there. Went straight to Carolina Law School after that, and then actually right after law school, I did private practice. I did criminal defense work. I did civil plaintiffs work, family law. My joke with everybody is we were street lawyers. If you came in off the street, we were your lawyer, and we figured it out. So I'm one of the very few people that started out in the criminal defense world and then shifted over to started off at the Attorney General's office, after about 6 or 7 years in private practice. And I went and went to the Attorney General's office, and then through that became involved with assisting SLED on a number of legal issues, and it worked out really well. And I've been at SLED now right at 7 years. I think next about 2 weeks from now, it'll be 7 years at SLED. So, it was funny. Everybody jokes about going to the dark side. I started on the dark side and then came over to the law enforcement side. And so I do think it helps coming from that type of background, where at least I've got a perspective on why things are done, or what criminal defense lawyers are looking at, or what we saw on the other side of that paradigm than what we've got. So, I try to bring that perspective to the conversation, just to sort of try and look at everything as holistically as we can.
Thank you, Adam. One of Adam's greatest attributes, and I've never told him that, is common sense. And we talk about common sense for a lawyer. A lot of time I get a lot of calls from all over the country on a lot of different issues, and I'm trying to figure them out, and I can't, especially when we get to a legal perspective. So I, you know, getting complex, I'm getting sophisticated without any kind of law degree, and I can't figure this stuff out. So I tell everyone I always rely on Adam to keep me straight and give me good counsel and advice. And not only he's done that, he also been a good friend. So I'm glad he's with us. He's with us today to talk about some of these issues. I guess let's get started right off the bat. Let's look at recruitment, retention, and hiring of a qualified law enforcement officer. We mean qualified. How we go about doing that? What are some of the obstacles in doing that?
That's the $64 million question, isn't it? I think if we had the answer to that, we'd all be, we'd all be very wealthy people if we, if there was the magic bullet there. No, that is the trick is, I mean, how do we, we've got to advance the profession. We've got to we've got to be better. That's the reality of what we see. That doesn't mean, oh, law enforcement officers are bad, but we know that we have to continue to advance, and we've got to that's hiring qualified people, and your people is where it starts and ends. Any law enforcement agency is as good as the decisions made by their people. That's where you are judged on the actions of your people, and when you're in that hiring posture, you've got to really factor that in and take that into account before I tell everybody, look, when we hire you, then you're ours. We own every decision you make. You are now us in every aspect of that. So really getting to hiring the right people, doing as full and thorough a background check as you can do on someone, and really getting the right people in the right fit it's a tremendous challenge. That's the reality that we're facing, is that what I know we were talking before we started, the numbers coming out of the Criminal Justice Academy over the last several years were indicating that more people were leaving the profession than entering the profession, at somewhat alarming rates. And how we address that is difficult, because funding is always an issue, pay is always an issue, morale is always an issue, from every aspect of this. So
what advice would you give to a student that are currently enrolled in the criminal justice program? What advice would you give them as far as completing their degree, going out, putting out an application for a law enforcement agency? What are some of the things that law enforcement going to look at? We talk about background checks and all that. So to give yourself a good opportunity of being employed in law enforcement, what do you need to do? You need to have good credit. You not need to have a criminal record. You need to be honest, integrity, not using drugs, and so on. So if you can sort of discuss how that hiring process works.
Well, and I think you pegged some of it. A lot of it is gonna. I know myself included. When you're young, you have no concept of where you're going to be down the road, and it's really hard to appreciate that the decisions that you make at 18, 19, 20 are going to really affect your ability to possibly do what you want to do later in life. So, being able to sort of have that longer view and appreciate that you really have to start looking towards, if this is something you want to do, you got to really start, preparing yourself. Like you said, you got to, you have to really have that self accountability sort of now to get where you want to be in the future for some of those types of things. Because I think we're only going to see more thorough background checks when we come into it. One big issue that I know lots of law enforcement agencies sees, and no law enforcement agency wants to be a stepping stone in your career. If we hire you, then we want you to be a part of us, and we're hiring you because we want you and we want to train you and make you the best that we can be. But we see so many applicants come in and say, hey, I really want to join the FBI. I'm like, well, that's not going to give me the warm and fuzzy that you're going to be at SLED a long time, and that I should really invest the time and resources in you. So, really, it's always sort of funny. We see so many applicants coming, hey, I really want to go do the next thing. And it's like, well, that's great. I love having a plan and I love thinking towards the future, but you're not going to really incentivize me to hire you over someone else that says, hey, I really want to be a sled agent. And I want to give 100% to sled every day. And instead of, I want to get everything sled's got to offer and learn and then go do something else. We've got to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. So we really want to invest in our future as much as we want to invest in the future of any of our applicants or any of our officers. We're always willing to invest in our folks but I mean, we want to invest so that we're better, you're better, all of the above, rather than just invest so that then you can go take that and make $1 million in the private sector or go do something else for some other agency. That's always a discussion point that we see in the application process. It's like, look, we really want to hire you and want you to retire from SLED. I mean, that'd be nothing greater for us to hire the right person and invest in your future and work together, across the board and not just be a stepping stone, because that's really, it's getting harder and harder for agencies to dedicate the resources to just have somebody, to have somebody go on and take all of our investment somewhere else.
We have a tremendous amount of job openings statewide and throughout the US in law enforcement. Why do you think we have such a large amount of vacancies in law enforcement agencies throughout the country?
I mean, I think just so much of that's going to go back to, I mean, it's just, there's such a negativity surrounding the profession right now. And I mean, not necessarily undeserved in so many instances. Something that Chief Gill says is that the law enforcement community spends a lifetime building and earning trust, and you lose it in a second. You lose it with one action, one mistake. The worst moment on somebody's worst day then becomes, the agency's face or the officer's. I mean, that becomes every bit of it. So, I mean, the public morale, just having folks sort of who are willing to go, dedicate their lives, dedicate their safety to the law enforcement profession right now. It's becoming more and more of a challenge. And again, that's not to say that there's not plenty of the bad actors out there that have done this. I don't think the sort of the stats bear out the prevalence of the bad actors versus the good actors in the law enforcement community, but that's what's, that's what we see so prevalently nowadays. It's harder to show good actions on behalf of law enforcement officers because that's not what's driving headlines nowadays.
You talked about these bad actors. How do we identify those bad actors before a major problem occurs? What can law enforcement agents have in place? I know a lot of agencies have internal affairs department. They have different systems in place to identify some of these folks, but still, I don't know whether it's through the hiring process, they slip through,
Sure,
or they within the department itself, and there's lack of supervision, lack of training, and I guess it's a combination of all. But what can we do to minimize those bad actors that we see out there in Minnesota and different places?
sure. I mean, one, I think you've identified it. I mean, the more robust background check process you can have is always going to be beneficial. One area that we focused on fairly recently is to set up sort of an ongoing, it's called the Personnel Early Intervention System. And I know that's a CALEA term that the CALEA standards have really modernized on that recently. So we sort of had to modernize our policies to address that. And the real effort there is to set up some internal trigger points, not necessarily punishment, not necessarily bad actions, but certain things. Let's say pursuit reports or use of force reports or traffic accidents, or set up a bunch of different trigger points where if an employee has a certain number of these, anytime you have 2 or more of these events happen in a 6-month period of time, it triggers your supervisor to go find out. Let's make sure there's not something going on in your home life that's affecting your ability and affecting your decision making. Do we have an alcohol problem? Do we have a crumbling home life that somebody just needs some counseling or something? I mean, so it's really as important now more than ever to set up some of those internal, systems and mechanisms to try and catch out, exterior problems of these folks. Again, these are human beings with family lives, with, sick parents, with all of these types of things that you face as a citizen or as any, human being. And obviously these, external stressors can affect your decision making. And the more we can catch those before you've got an officer who's out there, who's, at wit's end, who's had, who needs assistance, the more you can catch that and devote resources and divert that. And, if it's counseling, if it's some sort of, if it's a training issue, if it's whatever the case may be, if you can catch that and address it, and that doesn't necessarily mean punishment. I mean, if you identify bad actors, then you have to, certainly address that through internal agency discipline as necessary, but to also appreciate that there are so many stressors dealing with our folks in their lives, and trying to sort of really coordinate that. I know, in South Carolina, we've got the LEAP program. It's the South Carolina Law Enforcement Officers Assistance Program, and it's dedicated to identifying, and we've developed a peer support system. And I mean, it's designed to really address officers who are struggling with what they're seeing and dealing with on a daily basis. I mean, you come on a car wreck involving, just horrific, child fatalities, and you've got death. I mean, it's just a car wreck. I'm not talking even officer use of force. I mean, the officer seeing that and witnessing that, that's going to affect them. I mean, that's going to have a detrimental impact on their whether it's PTSD, whether it's, whatever the case may be, and trying to get that assistance and trying to offer that officer, help to address those types of issues, to ultimately to avoid that officer making a terrible decision down the road because they're not equipped to handle it. So, I mean, those are a lot of the efforts that we as a state have really focused on and tried to do. Obviously, there's more work to be done across the board on those types of efforts, but those are the types of efforts that you're really trying to get to. I'd be remiss to say, look, training across the board, we need to always improve the training posture, whether, just across the board. We can all use more training, but what gets lost in that conversation is if I've got half my agency training, well, then I've got half my agency that's not out doing whatever they're tasked with doing. And so we've got to account for all of those resources, so we're not short staffing, whatever patrols going on in whatever area. So, that's part of it, is like, hey, everybody's involved with training. Everybody wants more training, but when you're training, you're not policing, you're doing whatever else you're tasked with doing. So trying to sort of accommodate both is always a trick and always a task.
Operational and training is extremely expensive. So how do we determine what our training needs are? Is it based on incidents that occur, new policies that are in place, new enforcement methods, new equipment? So how do we decide on what to train on?
Well, I think, obviously some of that's going to be dependent on what your overall focus is. I mean, depending on the size of the agency, depending on the overall mission of the agency, that's going to dictate a lot of sort of where you need to go. I know there's always the ongoing conversation regarding sort of the militarization of police. And are we really, I mean, is training on those types of things the best training we can have versus, say, de-escalation, or versus some, or is there not some holistic model that we can accommodate all of the above? But I mean, really, it's going to come down to the agency's priorities, which are often set by the community's priorities. I mean, if you're talking about a municipal police department, well, the municipality is going to really dictate a lot of those priorities. I mean, what's important to that community, what's important to that, and that's going to dictate the direction, at least, of where where the training is going to go, or where the most need is.
the community need. Outstanding. Let me ask this question. Once a law enforcement officer go through the recruitment, selection, the hiring process, and actually get a job in law enforcement, he's assigned to the field training officers. Eventually he'll get out of that field training process, and he actually goes out there and start working in the field with the agent. What is the most training or supervision that we could give that person? I mean, we provided training, we sent him to the academy, we trained the person, we brought him to the agency, and we've done field training. We've issued him all types of equipment to do his job, and now he's actually out there. So what advice would you give to enhance a person's career? In other words, don't get yourself in trouble. Go and do a professional job. Is there anything that could be done about that particular situation other than what I just discussed?
Well, I think what you discussed is part of what we're trying to address and mandate. Because I mean, what you just said is not necessarily mandated for all law enforcement officers across the state or across the country. I mean, we have too many officers that simply don't have or haven't gone through all of those steps that you talked about, yet we're still now pushing them into that role of making that decision. I mean, the way the law is currently structured, and I was at a subcommittee hearing last week on it, the law is currently set up where an individual can go out there and be by themselves policing for up to 1 year before they've even gone to the academy. And that's obviously an effort that our legislature and we're working to try and change, but that's the truly sort of having everybody do what you just said, go through the academy, go through a robust field training program, which again is not mandated, right now. And then sort of really sort of putting in those checks and balances and a system to sort of just monitor, I don't want to say performance, but I mean, just to address concerns and to evaluate, how an officer is doing. That's really the direction that we need to go, and putting all of those in place is where we need to go. We don't have so much of that as we sit here now. That's part of what some of those efforts have been, is to mandate some minimum standards of training, to mandate some minimum, mandate a field training program and things of that nature, because that's how we really start evaluating, how you're going to react in a situation. Is putting you in a situation with a veteran officer and sort of working through it with the appropriate supervision.
Would you think some type of accreditation, whether it's national or state, would minimize some of the issues we just discussed?
Certainly. I mean, that's another one, is that there's no uniform minimum standards that apply, most, in this state or really across the country, and having at least some generally accepted minimum standards of all of those things is never a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, now I know we always need to focus. That's always going to be the floor, not the ceiling. We should always strive for more and do more than that. But at least having some generally accepted baseline is always a positive there. And I mean, those are the types of things that sort of don't necessarily get appreciated out there. Is that there are very few minimum standards. There's a probably an alarming number of small agencies that don't have policies, much less accredited, approved policies. I mean, they just don't have a lot of, policies in place to address a lot of situations.
Later on, we want to get into, near the end of the presentation, we're going to talk about this presidential order that came out several months ago. It goes with credentialing law enforcement agencies. They have to be in compliance with certain standards, and we'll go over that in a few minutes. But let's move on to another topic. Let's look at the type of technology in law enforcement, responding to technology and the changes in technology. When I first came in law enforcement many years ago, of course, I don't remember us having any kind of technology. We may have a two-way radio, right, basically, but all the stuff that we have now, we got iPhones, we got in-car cameras, we got hand cameras, we got pole cameras, we got all types of technology, computer. I can pick up my cell phone and just basically how we operate. Anything that we need to do now, we can do it on a cell phone. So tell me, let's discuss some of the technology, the advantages of having technology that would enhance law enforcement.
Sure. And I think what you said, I mean, the ease of access to information is always a positive for law enforcement officers. I mean, whether it's, you know, when you're dealing with an individual in any capacity, having real-time information about the dangerousness of that individual or the lack of danger of that individual, the more timely and the more sort of access to that information, the you know, sort of you can approach that situation with the appropriate level of caution, which may be greatly diminished if there's not a you know, long history of violence and outstanding warrants and things of that nature. So I mean, technology can certainly enhance that aspect of it. I think the reality is that, you know, with body cameras and with dash cameras, we've had to train all of our folks. You need to assume that everything you do is on camera, because and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because, you know, we should own the conduct, we should own the interaction, we should own what we're doing, and we shouldn't be afraid of somebody. I mean, if you're recording me, that's fine. I shouldn't be ashamed of what I'm saying or what I'm doing. I should be doing the right thing, and it shouldn't matter if you're recording me. So that's been a large sort of shift in just the culture, is that, look, I mean, we have to, you know, like you said, 10, 15 years ago, it was unlikely that the interaction was going to be recorded, or that there was going to be something. Now, I said, I think you assume every interaction is being recorded by somebody, whether it's overtly on the body camera or you know, a bystander with a cell phone or something like that. And I mean, that's just going to lead to accountability across the board. And, you know, that's often helpful in you know, in addressing situations. So you got sort of an unbiased observer. You got just the film that you can see. Here's exactly what happened. Here's exactly what was said. Here's the tone. Here's the everything, you know, on it, which is a plus. But it also, I think, puts that burden back on law enforcement officers to own their conduct. Because I mean, if you know, if you're doing the wrong thing on camera, it's just that much easier to address it, whether it's, you know, through discipline or whether it's through criminal prosecution.
If I make a statement, I'm sorry, go ahead, Adam.
No, I was going to say, the one thing, somewhat unintended consequence, it has certainly made discovery production in criminal cases a whole lot more onerous and a whole lot more difficult. I mean, it's not uncommon to have a case where you've got 16 different body cameras from 16 different officers for this entire encounter, and having to sort of produce all of that and get all of that, you know, that's just a somewhat time consuming and resource intensive process to do it. So it's great that we have body cameras and that we have all these things, but now we've got body cameras, you know, everywhere across the board. And that's whether that's civil subpoena production or criminal discovery production. I mean, those are just sort of resources that have to be accounted for across the board at both law enforcement and the prosecutorial sort of avenues.
Also, in evidence collection is another big
Absolutely
that we use, whether it's video or actual
Sure.
film and evidence and so on. Do you think with the onset of the video cameras, camcorders and all that, that law enforcement are caught doing the right thing majority of the time?
I mean, I think it certainly gives you that unbiased, and I'm aware of a number of instances, and you heard sort of when you were evaluating all of the body cameras that there's a number of agencies that had the body camera to sort of, you had a complaint come in that an officer was rude and unprofessional, and then you watch the video and it's, you know, there's just no basis to the complaint. So it's you know, like I said, it proves helpful in a number of instances, but that's not to say that it's not. Again, if you weren't, it's there, and now there's a recording for the world to see, good, bad, or ugly. So you better appreciate and sort of have that in the back of your mind when you're doing it. I know I've heard several instances where you got a heated exchange for whatever reason between a citizen and the officer's pointing to his camera to make sure that the other party knows, hey, I'm recording this, it's on, you know, and that sometimes can de-escalate the situation, that sometimes can do it, sometimes not. Obviously, there's some things that are beyond that, but I mean, sometimes it's that accountability can work both ways and certainly can prove helpful across the board. Like I said, you just got a neutral, unbiased, you know, version of events, if you will.
Would you agree that one of the best weapons that law enforcement officer have is his communication skills? And if you agree, why? We're talking about de-escalation.
Sure, and communication, I know one, you know, communication is key. I mean, across the board, and you know, being able to effectively communicate your expectations, or being able to communicate to try and avoid a use of force situation, or you know, trying to just communicate effectively with in any instance is critical across the board. You know, one of our chief's big talking points is to have, you know, an open line of communication with the community, or with your community leaders, or with the community. You can't wait until the crisis happens to open those lines of communication. At that point, it's too late. At that point, the crisis has happened. And I mean, if you have that open line of communication and you have that ability to effectively communicate, when the crisis happens, at least the dialogue can occur, rather than try and develop a relationship or try and open that. And so, you know, that's just absolutely critical towards, you know, trying to improve the law enforcement interaction with the community, is having the, you know, the ongoing conversation and having open lines of communication, you know, to address concerns and issues. Because again, once the crisis happens, it's too late to develop that line of communication. I mean, I mean, the boiling point's already happened. So that's you know, a critical facet, and teaching communication is difficult. That's one of those things that it's hard to teach someone how to effectively communicate. So that's another area that we're all in search of sort of bettering across the profession.
Why do you think it's such a difficult task to teach that? I notice in my criminal justice classes here, a lot of time, you know, we try to have interaction in class discussion, and all of it for a reason. Because your biggest weapon once you get into professional is be able to de-escalate by using your communication skills. So what advice would you give us to get more folks engaged?
Sure. Put down the cell phone and talk to people.
I have a rule, no cell phone in the class.
And that's, I mean, you say that kind of jokingly, but I mean, while cell phones have been, like you said, an incredible resource to everybody. You've now got everything you can imagine at your fingertips. It's somewhat sort of a lost art to just sit down and communicate with somebody, or to, you know, to just talk to people. I mean, you walk around and everybody's on their phone, or you see so many people at restaurants, and all 4 people at the restaurant are on their phone looking at something different. And I mean, just developing those human interaction skills is so critical, because I mean, I hate to say it's kind of a lost art now to just be able to talk to people and communicate with people. And so, I mean, focus on that and put yourself in situations where you have to do that. And I mean, that's the biggest thing is get away from, you know, be able to communicate effectively in person, as opposed to, you know, like I said, sending an email or sending a text or something. That's, I mean, you got to pick up the phone and talk, and you got to have that human interaction and go see the person. And, you know, that's that's another area that we tell all of our folks. I mean, go meet in person with all of the chiefs and sheriffs in your area. I mean, you got to put eyes on each other, and you got to sit across a, you know, table, whether it's having lunch or whether it's whatever. And I mean, I need to know, you know, that you can count on me. And if you need something, I don't want you to be a face on a page or a number in a phone. I want you to know exactly what I look like. So, you know, when we see each other, and you know, you can trust me. And I mean, that's one that we just all need to continue to focus on, you know, whether it's law enforcement or otherwise. I mean, we just, human interaction and, you know, conversational skills. It's just you only get better at it by doing it. So.
community engagement, and you hit on that. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do in the law enforcement professional is engage our community. We need to talk to our community. We need to talk to our community leaders. We need to visit, school, churches, attend community events. And what we want to do is put a human face on law enforcement, because law enforcement officers come from the community. And I think a lot of time the general public forget it. I think they think law enforcement officers come from Mars somewhere. They are not part of the community. And so we need to come up with some type of community engagement program. If you was going to design a community engagement program, and this is something that's not only in South Carolina, but it's nationwide, where law enforcement, the criminal justice professionals trying to develop a program to explain what we do, how we do it, and the reason we do certain things. Because a lot of time the general public see law enforcement react to a certain situation. As you know, it's about policy and practice and for the safety of the person being maybe arrested, or maybe the general public. So how can we go out and build that trust? I know we got community relations program and all that, but community relations and community engagement to me is something totally different.
Sure. Or they need to at least work hand in hand where like you said, and some of it's, like you said, it's just facilitating that discussion and that, bettering and ongoing that conversation. I mean, we need to require it, not just, hope that we do that, but sort of put our folks in, in the situation where they are going out, and sort of engaging in a positive manner with the community, and not just engaging with the community in traffic stops or in arrests or in situations like that. So much of the time, that's your only interaction with the public. So, I mean, trying to do that two-way street with officers and community leaders, I mean, it's going to start always with dialogue and communication and sort of knowing how and where to sort of try and facilitate those things. But it's sort of having the ability to listen and to set up some, mechanisms where, hey, if you've got issues that you need to address, we need to set up the ability and some mechanism to sort of get that brought forward and have that, addressed.
People usually trust people they know beside a stranger. So if you're going to try to build that trust, like you say, you don't want to wait till the last minute and you go out and some stranger come in to ask you to do something you don't know anything about that person. So I think community engagement is a key. Again, like you said, community policing is a good thing also. Let's look at officer safety and health, especially after COVID-19. Like you said, SLED have gotten an increase in calls since the COVID situation. So how can we protect our officers? I think you alluded to health, mental health in a certain way when you talked about the SCLEET program.
Sure. And obviously some of that's sort of working towards, identifying and addressing officers, issues that they face from day to day. But I mean, so much of the officer safety is going to be based on that community relationship and building some level of trust where, you're not afraid of the police, because fear is only going to drive the fear of the officer. I mean, that's only going to escalate the situation if we're not able to effectively communicate, or if we can't even have an open conversation in any way, shape, or form. And so, I mean, officer safety is going to always remain a primary focus of every law enforcement agency, because I mean, these are our folks, and I mean, we're we never want to put them into a situation that they're not equipped to handle or trained to handle. I mean, that's an inevitability sometimes, and we can't foresee every possible scenario, but it's really doing the best you can to give our folks the tools to effectively deal with situations that don't just escalate and get out of hands, and really having the resources to address issues that you're not putting an officer out by himself in a situation that he can't, that's going to raise his fear level to, and possibly drive bad decision making.
I think that caused a lot of use of force situations too, and we're going to talk about use of force here in a few minutes, that whether it's the police or whether it's the public is afraid of each other.
Or both at the same time.
Both at the same time, and that would cause a tremendous amount of problem. Is there anything that we can do to address that type of issue? You know, I said, while you're running, and the person hadn't violated any rule or law at all, and they cannot really answer that question no more. And, you know, I thought you was going to lock me up, but heck, you hadn't done anything to be arrested for. And then the police may think someone reaching for a gun and they're reaching for the driver's license.
Right.
And so it's that mentality that we have set out there that we are afraid of each other. Why we have such a mistrust, and I know you don't know exactly, is it social media have a lot to do with it, plays into that fear?
Well, I think that social media can sort of certainly, I don't know, you see the rise of social media, you see the rise of, I don't know, incivility, or people willing to say things anonymously on a social media post and just, you know, sort of the internet trolling, if you will. I mean, you see a lot of that affect just civility in general. And if we see the decline of civility in general, that's going to affect everybody. I mean, that affects both sides of the equation, whether it's the citizen who's not being civil with the officer, if it's the officer who's not being civil with the citizen, and whatever encounter, or both. And that's, you just see the I don't know, the disturbing trend towards incivility across the board. And I don't know how we address that. I mean, it's certainly a systemic problem that needs to be addressed, but how do we approach that and sort of get our folks to, I mean, again, you've got to earn that trust. And when we see bad actions and you see bad actors across the thing, that affects the trust of us. And so, you know, we've got to just work every day to earn that trust and earn that respect. And part of that's civil communication, part of that's not over policing, part of that's community policing. I mean, that's all part of the same sort of conversation and overall narrative.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about navigating public and private boundaries. And what I mean about public and private boundaries, law enforcement and criminal justice, they have a certain area, and the public has a certain area, but seem like sometimes we overlap each other's boundaries. Sure.
And one sort of the needle that you always try to thread, or that we try to thread, is that, I mean, as courts have recognized, and even the Constitution provides, I mean, law enforcement has a tremendous ability to access your most personal and private situations. So we've got to facilitate the appropriate safeguards to make sure that doesn't get abused, because abusing those types of resources and that type of power is what drives the negative perception of law enforcement. And I mean, like I said, we've got the ability to access, you know, virtually any aspect of someone's life, whether it's go in your house and search your sock drawer, whether it's go in your car and search everything in there. But again, we've got to put those appropriate safeguards so that doesn't get abused, and so that doesn't get there, and put those thresholds in there to do it. Because, you know, at the end of the day, there are some things that are, you know, private and off limits, and that should only be accessed in the most extreme circumstances, or you talk, you know, privileged conversations between attorneys and clients, or between, you know, priests and penitents and things of that nature. I mean, we have to have, you know, robust protections to protect the privacy rights, while understanding that if the pendulum swings too far and law enforcement is too restricted, then you're going to see an increase in crime. I mean, there's always this delicate balance between privacy and security, and where you get to and where you thread that needle, and, you know, what's the appropriate balance is always going to be somewhat of a community-based decision. How much privacy are you willing to sacrifice for security? Or can we do all of the above? I mean, we always strive to be as minimally invasive as you can, but, you know, that's an ongoing effort as well, just all the time.
It's a big challenge. I agree.
Absolutely.
Let's talk policy for a moment. And let's talk about the use of force, chokeholds, and so on, especially with the incident up in Minnesota. So let's go with use of force first. Our
Sure.
use of force policy.
Well, I mean, I think it's back to the earlier conversation we were having, and you know, requiring agencies to have a use of force policy. I mean, it's always somewhat shocking when you get there and it's like, oh, well, we really don't have one. We just go by the Constitution, or can we just have the Constitution be our use of force policy? And you know, when we look at policies, we always, you know, we try to draft the policy with a couple of focuses in mind. Like, one, we need to clearly communicate what you can and can't do. Because I mean, I really need to tell you where the rules of the road are, and we need to really address what we want you to be, you know, like what we want you to be doing. And to me, policy always has to go farther than the law. The law is the minimum baseline. Policy gets into day to day. Here's what I'm comfortable with you doing in these situations and these not, you know, while giving you the discretion to effectively do your job. So, I mean, having a use of force policy that accomplishes that is difficult. I mean, we constantly evaluate our policy, and we constantly review, are we, you know, are we doing best practices across the board? You know, at SLED, we investigate the vast majority of officer involved shootings. So we saw several years ago somewhat of a disturbing trend in officers shooting into vehicles. And so we really focused on rewriting our policy to try and set up appropriate rules of the road on, hey, this is when, you know, when you're facing that real danger, or when you're like that situation where someone's really just trying to flee and they may not present as egregious a threat. I mean, how do you address that? And writing a policy that says you can do this but not do that, it's always difficult, but you got to strike that balance between discretion and, you know, just sort of right and wrong. So we addressed that in policy several years ago. We actually, you know, put out a video on that, trying to sort of better all law enforcement training and made that available to everybody. And, you know, when we dealt with the choke holds and neck restraints and things of that nature, I mean, it was first and foremost very difficult to define the two, because there are so many, you know, so many people would consider all neck restraints chokeholds, where, I mean, a chokehold would be restricting airflow versus neck restraint, which is restricting blood flow. And trying to come up with a policy that addressed those situations was difficult, to the point where most practitioners, I mean, some of those neck restraints, unless you're a true trained expert and the size dynamic of the individuals comes into play, I mean, you really need to limit it to only the appropriate circumstances, which, you know, we just banned both, you know, neck restraints and chokeholds with our policy, unless you're in an extreme fight, you know, life or death situation where, you know, deadly force was authorized.
What about duty to intervene? I know a lot of law enforcement policies have a duty to intervene. If they see another officer doing something that is inappropriate, it's their responsibility to take some type of action and doesn't let it happen. So how does that work?
Sure, and that plays back into the community trust. Is that, I mean, there's always been the perception that law enforcement officers would not address their own and would protect their own and would protect bad actors. And that's something that we need to focus on, and we need to not only incentivize, but require. We've got to address, you know, illegal conduct in the appropriate manner, whoever's doing it, and sort of so we put, you know, a policy in place that mandated not only, you know, physically addressing a situation if it's safe to do so, but also at a very minimum, a reporting requirement where if you see it, you have to report it up to the appropriate agency or appropriate authority. And you have to, I mean, we have to pursue these things and then, you know, sort of protect individuals who do that type of reporting. That's another effort that we engaged in, you know, over this past summer was putting a policy in place to mandate that. And obviously we've shared that with anyone that needed it.
Thank you, Adam. We have several questions, Adam, that we're going to address. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne to address some of the questions that our participants have.
Okay, and before we do, let me just say, I remember when I had to do the vehicle training that SLED mandated, and I got a lot out of it. I thought it was really well done. So kudos on that. Okay, so one of the questions we got refers back to de-escalation, because that goes right in with the use of force discussion that we're having right now. What would you say is the key to de-escalation, and do you think that the training that we have out there available is adequate if it's taken advantage of, or do you think the problem is that just not enough officers are being trained in it?
I think it's sort of, as so many, I mean, we can always improve training. You know, we can always strive to sort of more tailored training to the real world situations. And that's de-escalation and sort of trying to avoid bias policing has been one of the primary areas that everyone's tried to focus on. And you know, we all struggle to identify the most applicable training to it. And it's really difficult because so much of it is, I mean, I can sit and watch a PowerPoint and I can watch videos. None of it's going to really train you to be that frontline officer on the street dealing with the situation, whether it's, you know, at a protest, whether it's at a situation that's escalating beyond a protest to something else, whether it's just a flashpoint use of force situation. So, I mean, it's really difficult to identify or offer. And I mean, that hands-on de-escalation training is something that I think we're all working to sort of identify and you know, because like I said, we can watch videos and it's like, okay, how would you have handled that? Well, I mean, that was that one instance with that one individual with their, you know, I mean, that's not going to be how the next individual you encounter is going to react. So this technique may or may not work for that person. So I mean, that's an area that we're all always striving to improve. And hey, John, you said if you want to set your folks up, somebody finds that idea, that's another $1 million idea right there. I mean, you can't find that.
Always trying to be creative, Adam.
Yeah,
You never know.
good. Hey, you know, no, but I mean,
Working on something.
You know, kidding aside, I don't mean to make light of it, but I mean, those, I mean, hands-on real world training is the most difficult thing for so many law enforcement agencies to find and to have the resources to get. Because I mean, again, if you're going to get the best training, it's going to be expensive, and having resources capable of doing that is always a trick and always a difficulty.
Adam, you've probably seen that in some jurisdictions, they're moving to rethink the way that the police respond to, for example, mental health calls and maybe even DV calls. And there's a lot of discussion of creating an approach where social workers or mental health professionals are riding with the police to these calls. Is there anything like that in the works here that you know of in South Carolina? And what's your thought on those types of approaches?
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest areas that I think has been identified as difficult, I mean, law enforcement officers by and large just aren't as equipped to deal with severe mental health issues as, you know, you'd like them to be. I mean, you have professionals who train and go through, I mean, have careers dedicated to dealing with that. And I mean, law enforcement officers simply will never have that level of training, you know, to put them there. Yet, day in, day out, we're putting law enforcement officers on the front line with someone with mental health and asking them to deal with it. So, I mean, to me, that holistic component to try and find a way to better utilize or to minimize the law enforcement involvement in true mental health crises and situations is always a positive effort. I mean, you know, that's one of those where I'm not aware of any specific efforts. I'm sure many agencies across the state are working with that. I know some already have them in place. I recall there was a Lexington County case where they had a mental health crisis response team that was staffed with mental health professionals who went with, and they were, you know, it was sort of a joint effort between those folks and law enforcement. And I'd like to think that that's a direction that everybody's is looking to going and that we should go, frankly, because again, law enforcement officers are often asked to deal with mental health situations just without the best training or capability to do so. And I can tell you, courts struggle with that mightily on okay, you've got someone with a known mental health issue. Does that mean that doesn't necessarily diminish the danger of the individual to the officer, to the community, but I mean, do we need to use less force, or do we shift down on the use of force continuum, and sort of balancing that is very difficult for courts and officers to approach day in, day out.
Adam, I want to go back to something we were talking about earlier when we were talking about body cams, and especially when there's an incident, a use of force incident that's maybe a little bit controversial. There's always a clamor by the public for the police to release the body cam footage. But you get into some issues with with an ongoing investigation that can be problematic with regard to investigative integrity and so forth. Can you just speak a little bit, because I don't know that a lot of the public really understands that dynamic. Can you explain? Can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Our primary focus, especially when we're, let's just take an officer involved shooting situation that is on body camera. I mean, our primary focus is always working to criminally investigate the situation as quickly and as thoroughly as we can. And you've seen throughout the country that if too much gets out too soon, that affects the witnesses. I mean, that affects the witnesses, you saw cases, and I want to say it was, Ferguson, where you had law enforcement officers trying to run down people claiming to be eyewitnesses who had seen nothing but the television or nothing but news articles. And that was a tremendous tax on resources in the investigative component to it. So, I mean, there's always that need to try and balance. Hey, we've got to get eyewitnesses. We've got to get, the investigation, and we don't want to compromise that by having to dedicate resources to folks who weren't eyewitnesses, who only saw the media reports of it and are claiming to be, an actual witness, and sort of, trying to deal with that and having the criminal investigation versus sort of maintaining the public's, ability to sort of trying to give an accurate version of events. That's always the tightrope that you're walking in those situations, and it's always a difficult one, for law enforcement agencies to get. I mean, in South Carolina, our law is pretty specific that body camera is simply not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so you cannot get it in most public request instances. So it's really up to the law enforcement agency to make that determination. Do we need to do this to really, address a narrative that's out there in the community, or do we need to just show this unbiased version of events, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, to get out in front of it. So it's a constant ongoing debate here and everywhere else on how to do that in the most effective way that doesn't compromise the criminal investigation, but that doesn't let, an inaccurate narrative become the pervasive narrative.
Thank you, John. I think we're about out of time. I think we
had a few more questions now.
Closing comments.
Yeah, Adam, I really appreciate, on behalf of the school, the faculty, our dean, program director, students that participated here in the class discussion. We really appreciate you taking out of your busy schedule to come over and talk to our school. So we're going to be calling on you in the near future.
No, happy to help. I mean, always happy if there's other specific questions that y'all want to send. I mean, I'm happy to whatever I can do to help. I'm always happy to help.
I know that, and thank you. We got a few more projects we got to work on too, so I don't want to build up all of
the work's never done. Now there's always
you almost work as much as I do.
So but
anyway, thank you, and thank the students for participating in it. Dean, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, a great job, John and Dwayne and Adam. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to the participants. We've recorded this, and so this recording will be put up later this week on our website. But thanks again, Adam. Really thank you for what you do over there. It makes an incredible difference.
Well, I appreciate it. And again, I'm always happy to help.
Okay, this will conclude our presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Y'all have a good afternoon.
You as well.